Okay, looks like we're right at 2 o'clock here. Welcome everyone to Planning and Planting Your Native Garden. Looks like we have, oops, I didn't see. We have 99 participants on right now. So we're just gonna do a little bit of an introduction. Thank you for attending. Brought to you by these partners on the screen. I'm not gonna read them all, but we have a lot of wonderful partners that have come together today to present to you this workshop. Just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, I'm Jenny Meisel with the Marion Soil and Water Conservation District. And for the housekeeping today, and what Suzanne just put in the chat, we'll have no video or microphone available for participants. If you need to have an immediate question, use the chat box for needs or concerns for audio or video issues. And then questions will be at the end of each presentation, and use the Q&A box if you have any questions. So we'll have each of the presentations will be about 25 minutes, and then we'll have a 10-minute question and answer session after each of the presentations. And then at the end, we'll have an extra 30 minutes from 3:30 to 4 for additional questions. And you are welcome to stay if you have time for that. If you don't have time, we will sign off at the end, or you can sign off at the end. And just a note that this event is being recorded and is also being live streamed on YouTube. So way to go. Hope we're reaching a better audience through all of that as well. Just a quick agenda. We're going to talk about what is a native plant and why are native plants important. And then we'll jump right into the presentations. We have Jeannie Taylor, who will be giving our first presentation. And then again, we'll have that 10-minute question section. And then we'll go to Amy Bartow with the Plant Materials Center in Corvallis with NRCS, and she'll be talking about plant-specific information. Then we'll have that last 10-minute question session. We'll talk a little bit about upcoming native plant sales from the local soil and water conservation districts. And then if you need to leave after that, that would be fantastic. Or if you can stay, we will see you again from 3:30 until 4. And I believe we have one quick little poll question for everybody right now. If you could please click the button on which of the following best describes your level of expertise with native plants, just so we can get an idea of our audience here for the speakers. That would be great. Can everybody see the poll? Getting responses?
Okay, almost everyone voted, so I'm gonna end the polling and see the results.
All right, looks like we're gonna see some results. Awesome. So it looks like we kind of have a definite mix of expertise here. So this will be great. Hopefully everyone will learn some new things for this presentation. All right, just quickly, we're going to talk a little bit about native plants. Essentially, a native plant are those plants that have been around in this area since before European settlement. So they essentially, native plants grow in specific ecoregions. So right now we are in the Willamette Valley ecoregion. So it would be those plants in the Willamette Valley ecoregion that were here before European settlement. And some of the benefits of native plants, they help provide us clean, cool water. They help filter pollution when they grow along stream sides, and they provide shade to keep that water cool for all of our aquatic animals. And they are fantastic for wildlife habitat. They provide food and cover and shelter for wildlife, and they support diverse native species if you plant diverse native plants. They also help with erosion control. All different kinds of root lengths help reduce soil erosion. They help hold in that soil and keep it from washing away or blowing away. And they're also resilient. They're adapted to our climate, the pests and diseases that are in our area. Generally, native plants require less water and less fertilizer and inputs than other non-native plants. So it's a great way to add some diversity to your yard and create wildlife habitat, and also to use less of those inputs that could be potential pollutants or wasteful. And with that, we're going to jump right into Jeannie Taylor's presentation. I'll let her kind of get going with the screen share. I'll stop sharing and then she can start sharing her screen.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'll just introduce myself and then I'll share my screen. My name's Jeannie Taylor. I live in Yamhill County with my husband, where we've been working with the Yamhill Soil and Water Conservation District since 2007 on an oak woodland restoration on our property. My professional experience is in botany and horticulture, plant propagation, and public landscape maintenance. As a native plant evangelist, I consult with gardeners and landowners to help them grow native plants. In 2020, I designed a large native planting at the Yamhill County Public Works Department parking area in McMinnville and worked with my local Yamhill chapter of the Native Plant Society of Oregon to install it. And in the future, I'll do tours and study native bees there for the Oregon Bee Atlas, where I'm a volunteer. Now I will share my screen. Is that working? Is that good for everyone? Yes, okay. So today I'll be discussing how to evaluate your planting site so you can find the right plants for your property. Because I have a very short time to talk and there's a lot of variables, I'm going to go pretty fast. But I want to let everyone know that there are handouts with information, and everything I'm covering is in the resource page. And there's also a question period following. So here we go. First, I'll take a brief look at the environmental big picture, and then I'll drill down to some specifics about the growing environment. And Amy is going to give you the information about particular plants. So first, climate. In Western Oregon, we have a moist maritime climate with moisture coming from the nearby Pacific Ocean and making our weather fairly mild and, of course, wet. Geologically, the Willamette Valley is a low-lying area. Let me get my pointer up here. That dropped, this low-lying area dropped as the Coast Range over here on the west and the Cascades on the east rose up. Geology has also created a double rain shadow effect that extends out across the Columbia Plateau and the beginning of the Great Basin, leaving most of the moisture on our side of the mountains. So valley topography varies from very flat and dotted with hills like the Eola Amity Hills, the Salem Hills, and steep Chehalem Ridge, and various scattered old volcanic cones. And then the foothills are actually from the Coast Range and the Cascades kind of merge here into the valley as well. So this graph plots two things, temperature over here and rainfall. Rainfall is the blue bar, and as you can see, it's high in the winter and into the spring. Temperature is the equal and opposite curve. As the year progresses, it gets hotter and hotter. And right in the middle here, you can see that it's the hottest when it is also the driest. And that is typical of what we call a Mediterranean climate. You might have noticed the prolonged droughts in recent years And that's because climate change has intensified this climate effect, sometimes with simultaneous longer dry spells and higher temperatures. And that's really taken a toll on some plants like Douglas fir. Now we'll look at a few microclimates and what you might see on your property. Here is a typical Willamette Valley wet prairie and riparian zone on the valley floor with tall cottonwoods and Oregon ash trees that form what's known as a gallery forest along the rivers in the background. I see some wetland here with seasonal standing water, and notice how flat the landscape is in this area. This is wet prairie vegetation with blue camas in bloom, and it's been very rare since European settlement. It used to comprise a very large area of the valley that farmland and development occupies now. The thing to notice here too is that bulbs like camas are just fine with soggy, wet soils all winter long. And many other bulbs are too. They bloom in late spring and then they set seed before the ground dries out. The bulbs can cure and store energy in the dry soil, and plants like sedges and rushes can be wet all year. And trees in the riparian zone access the high water table close to streams and rivers. Then in the uplands, oak, woodland, and savanna and upland prairie predominate. This is also quite rare compared to pre-settlement, and also due to activities like tree farming and ranching. Oaks can adapt to both wet and dry soils, and they do fine in the uplands. They also hold their leaves through the drought period and into the fall, so they can provide ongoing seasonal interest as well as habitat if you have the space for them. Here they are in the dormant state. This is an upland savanna and woodland in the foothills of the Coast Range. This soil can be quite thin, and the underlying basalt rocks often close to the surface. The clay soil dries out rather quickly because of this, but oaks, wildflowers, and native grass are able to grow there. This is a romer's fescue plot in here, for example. And after mid-July, many of these plants will go dormant, but grasses retain interest even into the winter. And some woodland shrubs will also provide fruit and structure in late summer. In the foothills of the Coast and Cascade Ranges, you'll see more conifers, and there are mixed forests of Douglas fir, oak, and madrone. Of course, I'm not including a lot of the tree farms or plantations that we normally see here as well. But you'll notice that Douglas fir is not very shade tolerant, but it does provide very cool areas in the understory, and you'll find many fine woodland plants for the shade garden. So I encourage you to explore more habitat and plants via this website, the Oregon Flora Project has done. This link's in the handout, so you don't have to worry about copying it down. It has lots of handy interactive features, and it's very helpful to help you plan for your particular site. So moving on to soil. Soil properties are a way of describing different soil types. I enjoy delving into this, but really there's not enough time today. So I have put a link and a document both in the handouts to help you do a really fun do-it-yourself soil survey anywhere on your property. But what you're going to run into with these, when people talk about soils, are these terms: texture, which is the individual property, pore space and structure, and organic matter. So we use those terms when we're talking about different soils because it describes how they behave. Texture, of course, refers to individual particles that are originally derived from rock. It indicates somewhat the history of how your soil developed. Particle size and pore space are closely related. So obviously sand, larger particle size, larger pore space. The pore space being the empty space between the particles. So sandy soil will drain a little faster, and clay soil, of course, drains very slowly. Silt is often found near streams and on the valley floor. Clay is ubiquitous. It has unique properties that make it difficult to work with, but also very valuable because it holds nutrients and water very tightly. The particles are orders of magnitude smaller than sand or silt, and they're also a different shape, so it's a very unique substance. These are the inorganic components of most soils, and they're present in different amounts in pretty much all soils. But texture is only the beginning of the soil story. Organisms, organic matter, and time perform the real magic. On the left, you can see a stylized soil profile. The top layer of plants provides some dead organic matter, such as leaves and twigs, and then microorganisms go to work on it. And it breaks down more and more into a form of organic matter that can't be decomposed any further, called humus. And this organic layer forms, and that's where most of the nutrients reside. If you live in a city or a housing development, though, you may find that your top layers of soil are completely missing, and you have more subsoil or construction soils. And the top layers might have been buried or removed. A layer of compost might have been added later, but if you dig down, you'll find a relatively compact and impermeable layer. So I'll talk about that a little bit in relation to plants in a minute. But on the right, you'll see what's called a soil PED, P-E-D. It's like a super large soil particle that is very stable, and it provides spaces for air and water drainage. It's composed of soil particles held together by plant root exudates and byproducts of microorganisms working on organic matter. So you'll find it up here in this layer. And as they interact with roots, the microbiome literally glues these PEDs into stable structures. This structure is how carbon can be stored in undisturbed soils for decades and even centuries. And it's one big way to reduce the effect of excess carbon in the air. Pore space between particles is important because plant roots need air as well as water to survive down there. This diagram shows how larger soil PED structure, so these are not particles, these are actually particles glued into those larger PEDs, keeps a lattice of pores open for plant roots. So why is this important? Structure takes time to develop. It's stable and it allows air and water to flow properly through the soil. In short, it gives your plants a great place to grow. Soil structure is a framework for soil life, just like the framing in a house with rooms that are comfortable and functional. If you till the soil or compact it with equipment and foot traffic, it's like taking a wrecking ball to your house. You still have the same amount of material, but it's really not very useful anymore. So do try to limit the amount of compaction and soil disturbance. But whatever soil type you have, whether clay, or sandy, well-developed or disturbed, there is a native plant that has adapted to it. Look for plants that grow in the conditions that you already have, and they'll be more successful. Of course, if you're like me, there will always be that plant that you just have to have. And you might talk yourself into thinking you can put it in a less than ideal spot. I think we've all done that. If you do want plants that require different soil, richer soil, for example, it's almost always a good idea to add more organic matter by top dressing with compost, or you can mulch to improve the soil texture and the water holding capacity. It will draw down into the lower layers. But native plants, remember, never require fertilizer. That's one thing you don't have to worry about. I've actually built a shrub bed on top of driveway gravel by depositing subsoil and adding a layer of compost, and it actually worked out just fine. So go ahead and be a lazy gardener, leave the leaves and dead stems, and provide an environment for overwintering beneficial insects that way, and protect the soil from erosion and compaction. Also, uncut grass is really useful to ground beetles, which are very beneficial in the garden. I want to mention our native bees just briefly. Surprisingly, we have hundreds of native bee species in Oregon, and they do a great job of pollination, but they need our help. As you can see, they can be very tiny. On the lower left, I'm pointing to the entrance to a bee nest in the soil. If they're very mighty, you can see how much pollen this little Andrena mining bee can carry. 70% of our native bees nest in the ground, and that means leaving a little bare and undisturbed ground will really increase pollinators. On the right, you can see the diagram of a mining bee nest. They put chambers down from the top, and they put one egg and one pollen ball in there for the larva when it hatches. So you can really see why not compacting or tilling will really help them survive the winter as either a larva or a pupa, or in some cases even adult bees will rest in the winter there to begin their work in the spring. Other bees actually nest in dead pithy stems like old raspberry and blackberry canes. So leave those over the winter to give more homes to bees too. And if you want to cut them in the spring, leave about 8 inches of stem, and they'll begin new nests in those cut stems. It'll be like having a bird feeder, only you can watch bees. So there are lots more great tips from the Oregon Bee Atlas at this link. Again, in the handouts, it's from members who've written these very helpful little tips for gardeners about bees. So moving on to water, you might be thinking, well, I have wet soil, what should I plant? What should I do? Harking back to that rain graph of the wet winters and dry summers, it's really helpful to think about when your soil is wet. Is it just in the winter? Does it dry out in the spring? Does it dry out in the summer? Or is it always wet? You might have a really wet pocket of soil, and there are native plants that will just think that's the greatest. And then you want to look at how long it holds water. For example, if you're irrigating in the summer, does it drain fast? Does it drain slowly? And that depends on the soil texture and the amount of organic matter. So like I said, all these things interact. And in the handouts, there's that do-it-yourself. It's called a perk test, and it'll tell you how fast your soil drains. And you can match that exactly to the kinds of things that are required by whatever plants you're interested in. So your soil might be both wet and dry. Obviously, in the summer, it could really be dry. And sometimes those clay soils just turn right to concrete. But because of our climate and the plants that interact with them, plants have adapted to get the job of blooming and fruiting done while it's relatively warm and still wet. So in that spring period, generally. The camas that loves the wet spring will be going dormant by midsummer. And Osaberry on the right here is another plant that blooms and fruits. It's probably one of our earliest blooming shrubs. It fruits early, and by mid to late summer, it doesn't really need those leaves anymore. And you're going to see frequently yellow leaves, which is totally normal. So to deal with the tendency of some of these plants to go dormant for survival, consider planting species with late summer interest to fill that gap in. For example, some trees and shrubs do hold their leaves longer, like the oaks. They might hold their fruit later. There's evergreens that are very good garden plants, and late blooming perennials. Those are all good choices. So water is a finite resource, and we always mention how water efficient native plants are, but native plants are like any other plant. To get young ones or new ones established, it's going to be necessary to water them for the first 2 to 3 years during that summer drought. Also, in a managed setting like a garden or a public landscape, it might help to give them a drink once a week, really deeply, so that they don't do that yellowing leaf thing and they just look a little bit more ornamental. So just be sure to do a deep soak and then let it go for at least a week. If you have very sandy soil, I find that sometimes you split it into 2 and water twice a week, but a little bit less. Once established, you're probably not going to water very much at all. So moving on to sun and shade. This is the standard light requirements. 6 hours a day qualifies as full sun, and less than that, part shade, and less than 3 hours, full shade. So plant label descriptions usually indicate the plant exposure that you're looking at, but those are kind of just guidelines. So what you need to do really is look at your own site and map it out for yourself. Just walk around and check how the light, the water, and the soil interact with also your slope over the day and throughout the year. There's kind of a nice document in the handouts on how to look at light in your garden. And I know this is kind of intuitive to know that more light equals hotter equals drier. But in your garden, you're going to find you have different kinds of situations. And also morning and afternoon sun are not the same thing. A shade plant might be fine in the morning if it has afternoon sun. The afternoon sun is usually very hot and very intense. And then dappled shade, of course, all those in-between things. So here's a couple of examples. Lots of plants that grow in wet ditches are fine in shade with not very much water because it's not as hot and it's not as dry. So you find cow parsnip in ditches all the time. It's one of my favorite plants, and here it is in my woods with no water really to speak of. Also goldenrod. Goldenrod normally would want to have full sun, but here it is on a dry, dapple, shaded slope, and it gets a little floppy, but it blooms just fine, and it really doesn't need any water. Here it is in full sun. Of course, more butterflies in full sun, but it's a lot stockier, you can see, but it does fine in both places. That's just probably a wetter site. So to recap this kind of very fast romp through all these different variables, there is a handout available. So do have a look at those. Remember that soil, water, sunlight, and topography are all interacting for your site. Check your drainage soil rate, do that perk test. It's really fun, actually. And look at your site over the year and during the day to determine where the light is and how it changes, because you'll probably have a lot of different microclimates. And don't forget to look up and think about what your plant's going to look like when it's completely mature, because it may need more space than you think. They're so cute when they're small. They're like puppies. And then one day you realize that something isn't right and everything's all too crowded. Also check for seasonal shade because, you might forget that those trees leaf out and then you don't have that sun anymore. And remember that native plants might go dormant, and that's totally normal, but think about providing year-round interest. Match your habitat to a known habitat if you can. That's very helpful. And you probably do have more than one. Check out that Oregon Flora website. And if you do have that construction soil problem, which a lot of people do, look at some extreme environments like rocky balds or plants that grow in very, very dry places. Sometimes in the mountains, there's some great plants. If you want to go outside our Willamette Valley zone a little bit, Northern California, Southern Oregon, on the coast, and some of the plants on Mary's Peak, for example, like hairy manzanita, those are great for those awful, hard to deal with places. So just kind of to wrap it up, for success when you're choosing your native plants, think about the big picture and then examine your own microclimate and soil and provide for the creatures that live in our local habitats when you can. And here's my contact information. I think I can take some questions now, and one of our moderators is going to curate that.
Hi everyone, I'm Suzanne Teller from Luckiamute Watershed Council, and Haley from Polk Soil and Water Conservation District, and I will be happy to read out any questions you have for Jeannie. Just type them into the Q&A box, and we'll take turns asking them to Jeannie and give her a chance to answer. We'll have about 10 minutes now, and you'll have more time at the end if we run out. I do see that there is one question that was already in the Q&A box. She's hoping that somebody will address how to deal with aggressive natives in the garden, especially those that give off lots of seeds, such as Clarkia, self-heal, etc.
Yeah. Well, two things. I guess it's great to be successful. So great. It's good that you have too much of things. With the, of course, you can dig or transplant the seedlings, give them away, that sort of thing. I guess, you know, trial and error, experimentation. Like if you decide that you really do like them, keep them. If you don't like them, you know, it's okay to switch to something else. And well, the annuals can be, you know, outcompeted by certain perennials. I was thinking when you said aggressive, I was thinking of goldenrod because it is a perennial and it has a tendency to run, and people sometimes complain about that. But I think what you have to do is just think of your own situation and what you would like to see there, what you'd like to have. And I think also about having large amounts of one thing. That's really helpful to pollinators because they don't want to go pecking around to one plant here, one plant there. They like to have a large display. And if you have a lot of something, that's actually a lot better for bees and butterflies and beneficial insects. Hope that answered the question.
Suzanne, do you mind touching really quick on where people can find handouts? I have a couple of questions in the chat about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I did post it in the chat previously. I'm going to put it in there again right now, so you'll have that link. And as a reminder, there are already the handouts that Jeannie mentioned. We'll be posting more handouts if, you know, as more come up during the presentation. So keep that link handy. And that's where you'll find everything you'll need to know. I'm putting it in right now. There we go.
All right, I'll do another one and then I'll let Suzanne take a turn. Oliver asks, do you have examples of favorite low maintenance full shade plants, Jeannie?
That's probably a question for Amy. Amy, do you want to chime in on that one?
Maybe. So I think maybe we should wait and see if my presentation answers those questions. And if I don't, then ask me that question again at the end when I have my Q&A.
Sounds good. Here I have a question from another participant. Thanks for your presentation, Jeannie. Can I grow evergreen huckleberry on a side garden that gets morning sun? It will be near a blooming dogwood tree, but not underneath it. I have another huckleberry under deep shade and understand it grows bigger in shade, but will it still do well with morning sun, and in the afternoon, house and tree will provide protection from afternoon sun?
Yeah, that sounds fine. I think morning sun would be just great for them.
All right, looks like another question here. And I think this is a topic that will be covered later on, but a good place to get native plants.
that be covered as part of the presentation?
Yep, that will be covered later on at the end of the presentation. Okay, another question. What native plant, oh, this one I believe we're going to be covering under Amy's, so I'm going to skip that one for now. And here's another one. Hello, I'm replanting in burnt areas along the North Santiam. Will I crowd out the original species of plants that are trying to come back naturally with new species I plant? I don't know what all was there originally before the fire. Ferns, blackberry, and vine maple were some, I think.
So is this a burnt, did she say burned area?
Burnt areas, yeah.
I'm a big fan of watching what comes back after that kind of disturbance. Unless you have a real problem, like an erosion problem, I think a lot of stuff will show up. And one thing I've noticed in my area is that once we took out the Scotch broom and things like that, there were a lot of native plants that were just waiting to come back. And so if you can hold off just for a little bit, I think you might be pleasantly surprised. Also, I don't know, maybe somebody else can address this, but with burnt areas, I don't know if mulching is advisable to, kind of help heal over the scars. I don't have a lot of expertise in that area.
I have another question here, Jeannie. How to control aggressive tall Oregon grape spreading? Just cut back the rhizomes underground, but was wondering if coyote brush and any other plants nearby will help to stop the spreading.
Oh, probably. If you have, sometimes you just have to let them fight it out. And you could cut those. If your Oregon grape's getting a little out of control, just try cutting it after all the new energy has come up into the plant in the spring. Like during that summer drought period, that is a good time to knock a plant back because there's not going to be any moisture to speak of coming down for a while. So, you could just cut them to the ground in June, around the edges, maybe that could work if you want to keep those. And also the root pruning the rhizomes is that's fine. If you can dig, if your soil's not too hard and you can dig those up, those roots are highly prized by some people. So that's just an aside.
And here's another question for you, Jeannie. Do you have recommendations for native shrubs that grow 2 to 3 feet high in full sun?
I think that's another one for Amy.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on then to, let's see, any advice for mixing natives with already established non-natives?
Well, I would say it's just like having a regular old perennial garden or shrub bed or anything. They're just like any other plant. So if you find that having non-natives first and then adding natives, or having natives and then adding non-natives, it's fine to do that in a garden setting if you're not trying to do a restoration or something. And that can really extend the season too. So, it's not going to hurt either one of them to, be there together.
All right. Thank you, Jeannie. I have a question. And just a reminder, I'm getting some questions in the chat. So please put your questions in the Q&A section down below. It helps us keep track a little bit better. The next question is, should we mow down a flower bed in the late fall?
You can. I guess I would ask why do you want to mow it down? Maybe you have a good reason to mow it down. I would say generally leave everything, and because of the the nesting habitat and that sort of thing, and the less disturbance in the fall the better. But if you do have to mowing when the soil is dry in the fall is better, because you don't want to be running equipment or walking on an area that is wet. That will be it'll really compact the soil a lot. So if you do have to mow, or if you feel the need to mow, when it's dry in the fall, or when it's frozen, when the ground's frozen, you can do it then too. Is probably the better time to do it.
Thanks, Jeannie. Here's a question. What is the effect on soil structure from using a broad fork? Can you improve drainage without disturbing things too much?
A broad fork? Broad fork. Is that like a spading fork? I think I know what he's talking
Yeah,
about.
if my thinking is correct, it's like a pitchfork or.
Yeah, so it's like a fork, but it's got thick blades on it. So you can, that is one of my favorite tools. And if you're gonna dig, that's a good one to do it with. Yes, hand digging, you're gonna disturb the structure, but sometimes you have to do that to get your plants installed. So, you know, just, yeah, that's a pretty low impact way if you don't go nuts with it. And if you feel like you need to, the thing is that ground preparation, it kind of varies with the situation. So it's kind of hard to say yes, no, but yeah, spading forks it's a great weeding tool too.
All right, Jeannie, I have another question. I'm not sure if this would be best for Amy or Jeannie, but it's not been clear to me from the native plant brochures I've gotten from different organizations, the difference between native plants in general and native plants best for pollinators like these. I hear a lot about hummingbirds and butterflies being pollinators, while others have suggested that they aren't very effective pollinators, but are nice to look at. Could you talk about which are pollinators and which are not?
Wow. Oh, that's a huge subject. I would direct you to the Oregon Bee Atlas. They have a web page with quite a bit of information on it. There's been a lot of research lately on which plants are good for the insects that do the most pollination. And so there's some ongoing study. And I would say just try to keep up with the native plant societies. A lot of times you'll get, I've heard a couple of talks from researchers, and they have information that hasn't been published yet. So Corvallis Native Plant Society, Portland Native Plant Society, they've had some really good information from people about pollinators. The thing is that if you are helping to increase the number of plants that normally would grow here, you know, pre-settlement or whatever, aside from the fact that Indians did a lot of land management through burning and through digging and that sort of thing. So it was a managed landscape. It was mainly an open landscape. And so if you can plant anything that grows and blooms in the sun, that's a native plant, you'll be making your contribution. And I think it's best not to get too involved in which are the best plants for this or that. I think if you plant native plants, stuff will come, and you'll get to study and know your own, you know, environment and what you've brought by planting the native plants.
Thanks so much, Jeannie. We are done with our first 10-minute question and answer, but do not despair for those of you that we have not gotten to. Some of them and Amy will be able to answer after her presentation during that 10-minute session. And there will also be that additional Q&A session after 3:30, the half an hour extra Q&A session for anyone who'd like to stay on. So with that, I will leave it to Amy to start her presentation.
Okay, I guess I'll do a quick introduction of myself before I start sharing my screen. I'm the manager at the Corvallis Plant Materials Center, which is a part of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. We have a 50-acre research farm where we find vegetative solutions to natural resource concerns. So this would include things like soil health, pollinator habitat. We work on ecological restoration, and we've done a lot of native plant research over the years too. So, okay, now I will see if I can share my screen. Okay, can you see it? Okay. I apologize for my super boring title. I think I should have called this Plants I Like to Talk About, because really there's no way that you can possibly cover all the possibilities when it comes to native plants. So keep in mind, this is just a subset of the possibilities, and I tried to focus it a little bit on the plants that are available through the native plant sales, so that reduces this, the number of plants that I'm talking about just because of that. Here's a little overview of what I'll be covering today. So we'll talk a little bit about the resources that are available. Then we'll go into talking about shrubs, and I'll kind of talk about things in general based on whether they're wet or dry or sun and shade. And we'll cover herbaceous plants like annuals and perennials and bulbs. I'll have some quick examples for extreme environments. And then if we still have time, I'll cover picking out some plants for maybe some specific purposes like pollinators or wildlife or seasonal interest. They've included the links to the resources page, but if you've never seen this before, I even keep my copy with me. This is a really great resource. It was put out by Portland Metro back in 2014. It's called Native Plants for Willamette Valley Yards. It's wonderful. It's not any sort of like sorting tool, but for each plant, they have lots of really great information, and even those cute little icons that tell you about sun, shade, moisture, or if they're good for wildlife or pollinators, and kind of their general ecoregion that you might find them in naturally. So great resource. And Jeannie mentioned this is kind of a new thing. I'm super excited about it. They haven't really rolled the full thing out yet, but it's great. This Oregon Flora project. And I did some screenshots of things they have. So they even have these neat things, these like plant combinations where you can choose one of these habitat types, like a rain and water garden or the woodland garden or a meadowscape. And then it kind of gives you like some plant choices that are good for those areas. They also have here on the left where you can search for these like plant features, like sunlight and size, and then even like lots of stuff, flower color, bloom months, wildlife support. So it's really exciting. You can use these search functions to find different plants for your landscape. And then here on my little blue circle, it says coming soon, but commercial availability. And they're really hoping that different nurseries will link into this and write down that the species that they have available so people can know where to find them. Because that's always a challenge with native plants, because I can think of all the ones I see out on the landscape and not as many are commercially available. So also it's really helpful for the nurseries that when they have something, they can really tap into their audience and make these things available. I think it'll really help with the nursery market. So because I work for USDA, I have to put in the plug for my own agency. This is the plants database. It's not super great for gardeners, but there is really good information, especially if you can find the species that have these plant fact sheets. There's a lot of detailed information, and those are really informative. This is another thing that we put together years ago, Plants for Pollinators in Oregon. This covers not just native plants, but it has a lot of non-native plants too. It's a lot of tables and stuff, so it's pretty just table-oriented, just plant lists, but it's a pretty comprehensive grouping of plants on there. And if you are really interested in pollinator conservation, I highly recommend the Xerces website. They have lots of great information. They have things nationwide. They have things, more localized too. They have great books, great fact sheets, and it's beautiful. They have beautiful pictures of plants, beautiful pictures of bees. It's great. Okay, I don't think I'll be doubling up on anything that Jeannie has mentioned, but one of the first things that you have to consider when you're thinking about what you want to put in your landscape is you have to think about the things that you have control over. So these are I call them the flexible considerations. So these are the things that you choose. So when you're thinking about what you want to put in your landscape, the first thing a lot of us think about is what we want it to look like. Like we want it to be pretty. So aesthetics are a really big thing. Some people are trying to create privacy, living fences. Sometimes people want a functional thing like a windbreak. Other people really value wildlife habitat. And we already had questions already about low maintenance landscapes. That's a really important thing too. Some people are trying to stabilize soil or create riparian buffers. And a lot of us also, we want to be able to grow food. We want to grow herbs and medicine with the plants that we've chosen. But then we also have to work within the confines of what we're given. So these are the inflexible considerations. And it would just take a major effort to change any of these things on our site. So it's probably easier to create more sun if you were just to chop down trees, but creating shade takes a long time. Your soil type, whether it's sand or clay, is really hard to change. You can build up on it by building raised beds, and you can add compost and you can improve drainage. A lot of times you can't really change the type of soil that you have. Space. If you're space limited, that's kind of hard to change. You can kind of go up sometimes when you grow like plants taller and have more structure, but it's hard to create more space. And moisture. You can always add more water in the summer, which tends to be a limiter for us, but it can be really difficult to drain away all that excess water that we get in winter. I like seeing the poll question and seeing that there was a lot of people who were beginners, and I like to see lots of new people coming in to learn about native plants. And it seems like a lot of you guys are intermediate, so this might be totally old news for you guys, but I always want to start with some of the basics if people are really questioning where they should start with putting native species in their landscape. And these are my top 5 no-fail shrubs. I think these plants are really, they're happy in a wide variety of conditions, so they're pretty adaptable. They're hardy, they're easy to maintain, and they don't really like spread or take over other things in the landscape. Snowberry will send up more runners and kind of move around a little bit, but even still, it's pretty manageable. So then I have these like informational pages for some of the species. Red flowering currant, it's just, I love this tree. It's really beautiful. Usually tops out about 12 feet tall. It's deciduous. In some of these slides, it says the drought tolerance, which sometimes can seem a little bit backwards. So we're talking about their tendency to tolerate dry conditions. So with this one being medium, means that it can handle wet to medium, I guess. It also likes full sun to part shade. It's an early spring bloomer, and you'll often see bumblebees and hummingbirds going to it, and it supports a lot of beneficial insects, hummingbirds, and then even with the berries, the currant berries on it too. Those are great for birds and mammals too. Ocean spray blooms later in summer, so I do really like this one for pollinator hedgerows and stuff. It's deciduous. It has more of a spreading habit too. It's my slide says low drought tolerant, but I've seen this in some pretty dry areas. Also, tons of different beneficial insects. Not as much of the showy, like big insects like bumblebees, but you'll see a lot of syrphid flies and small native bees on this shrub. My pictures of this shrub do not give it justice because it's really a beautiful plant. This is red osier dogwood, not the beautiful flowering dogwood, but this one has these clusters of white flowers on it. It's deciduous again and has really pretty red stems. This thing can grow in pretty wet areas. You'll definitely find it in wetlands. Again, it's pretty adaptable, full sun to part shade, and supports lots of insects with its flowers. And there's some ornamental varieties of an eastern plant within the same genus, but ours is the Pacific 9-bark deciduous shrub. Again, like not much taller than 12 feet, full sun to part shade. A late spring bloomer, kind of when everything else is blooming. But I see lots of different types of insects on this plant. common snowberry. So this is kind of one of those shrubs that falls into that category of being short. I don't think of it oftentimes as being a shrub, but it is woody. It can get taller in shady conditions, but it does like full sun to shade. It sometimes can be vining. If it's in deep shade, it'll climb up things. But it does kind of spread. It sends up new shoots, but it's not going to run all over like milkweed or salmonberry or something. So I picked out a list of shrubs that are good for shady areas. So the first column is arranged by height, with the tallest shrubs at the top of the list and the shorter ones at the bottom of the list. And the second column is species that are a little bit more like brambles. They're the berries. They act a little bit more like raspberries, but they'll send up shoots and they can kind of take over and be a bit aggressive. Also, the ones in bold are evergreen, and the one with little asterisks by them are ones that I've found to be kind of tricky in certain situations. So they're just a little more particular about their habitat. They're more likely to fail. And so it's worth trying them out if you want them, but your site may not be conducive to them. But I always think it's good to try. So I'm not going to go into every one of these species on my list, but we'll go over a couple of them. Red elderberry. Sometimes I think of these actually being trees. They can get really, really, really big. They're not just a shrub, but they're really great. I love their flowers and the berries. They're really beautiful. This is what I don't hear a lot of people talk about, but it's always been one of my favorites, and it's interesting its distribution. I even found it up on like Crater Lake and in places you wouldn't think it would normally grow, but it's a really neat plant. It's a shorter shrub, and I've noticed that even when I find it in alpine areas, they're like miniaturized, and even when you bring them down to the valley, they stay miniaturized, which is kind of neat. But ours that live here in the valley, yeah, I never see them more than like 8 or 10 feet tall. They bloom in summer and have these nice little yellow flowers, and then the berries aren't particularly tasty, but they're not bad. And Jeannie mentioned this one too, Osoberry. I think this is one of my favorite shrubs because I always get really excited for spring. And so when I see this blooming, I know that we're almost done with winter. So I'm always really excited. It's a pretty small shrub and pretty dainty. And I see it more in shade than I do. It can tolerate some sun. I've grown it out in full sun. It's not as happy, but it will tolerate it. And it does like moist soils. Salmonberry does best in shady, moist areas. I think of it really as being a coast range plant. That's where it can get really monstrous. But I do like it because it's one of the first berries that we get, like real true berries that we get in spring. So I like that. It can be a bit aggressive. I grow it out in full sun, which keeps it manageable, or I like to put it in the understory of hedgerows just for diversity, because the beautiful pink flowers that come out early are really great. And I do see bumblebees and other pollinators use them. So my groupings aren't native plant laws. Most of these plants are adaptable to a wide range of conditions. And so don't be surprised if you find conflicting information between the resources. It just kind of means that plants are, tolerant of a wide range of conditions. And what I might say grows in sun, you're also going to find it in the shade. And tall Oregon grape is a great example. It's a little more manageable to grow it out in full sun, but it also goes great in the shade. So don't take some of my groupings as like strong recommendations. And so this list is similar to the other one where it's arranged by height. The first column will have the tallest plants at the top and the shorter plants at the bottom. And then the ones on the right side are a little bit more like spreading and brambly. And if they're in bold, that means that they are evergreen. And then we'll go over a couple of them. This one's been mentioned a little bit, tall Oregon grape. I think my favorite thing about this plant, actually there's two things I like about this plant. I like the early spring blooms, which is really, really important for pollinators. And we have one growing outside of my office window, and it's a one-way glass, and the cedar waxwings love to come and eat the berries. And they can't see me because I'm right inside the glass, but they really like this plant. So I like it for the wildlife value. I don't think it's terribly pretty, and it can get really aggressive and spread, like someone else mentioned too. But I like it because of the benefits that it provides. Serviceberry. This one can look like other shrubs. It can look like our native crabapple in a lot of ways. It's kind of indistinct in some ways. It's a nice species. I have seen it have some rust on it here in the valley, which can reduce the berry production, and create some crooked stems. But not all of them in the valley have that. So it's something to watch out for. Mock orange. This is a beautiful plant. The first time I ran into this in the forest, I thought it was an escaped ornamental because I was just like, native plants don't look like that. This thing is amazing. But it is really beautiful. And I love having it in landscapes. It's really manageable. It does well, even though I have it in the sun category, it's definitely one that can live in some partial shade. It likes it. And we have this one in like a hedgerow, and even when we coppice it and cut it back, and it like resprouts, and I really like it. So I'm glad Jeannie already broke the ice about using plants outside of our ecoregion, because I'm really a fan of using some of the Northern California species or the coastal species, and it's your landscape. You're not doing ecological restoration. If you like a plant and it's not aggressive and it's not going to escape and become invasive, use what you like. And this is a plant that I really like. It's called California lilac. It's native to Northern California and maybe a little bit into Southern Oregon, but I've never seen it in the wild in the Willamette Valley. There's lots of cultivars. And so it's really, you can pick out ones that are specific to your situations. They come in different heights. There's ones that are almost like a ground cover. There's ones that are these really nice, beautiful shrubs. One of my favorite things about it is really just how many bees are on it. It's incredible. It's also just really pretty. It's compact. I mean, even when you run into them like in the wild, they look like ornamental plants. They are really beautiful, and they're evergreen. And we don't have a lot of evergreen shrubs that grow like this and stay compact, but are still like shrubby. And so I like it just for winter interest. I think it's really beautiful. Okay, that's what I have to say about shrubs. And now we'll work on talking more about herbaceous plants. I'll go over annuals, perennials, and bulbs. This grouping doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you're trying to pick out plants, but it's just a way for me to talk about them. I love using annuals in my landscape, just like you would with non-native plants. I like to use seed though, and I don't see a lot of native plant sales selling containerized annuals because they're actually really hard to grow in containers, and it doesn't really make sense because it just live for 1 year. So I use seed and kind of just sprinkle the seeds around where I want them to be. And I'm okay with a messy landscape, so this works for me. Perennials, a lot of our native perennials take a while to grow, and they usually don't bloom until their second year. So going with containers is the best way to install habits, like flowering plants more quickly. And then bulbs, starting from seed, bulbs can take anywhere from 3 to 7 years before they flower. These are super slow growing plants, and so you would never want to start with seed. And so just like daffodils, you wouldn't start daffodils from seed. You go and you buy some bulbs. So I definitely recommend buying dormant bulbs or containerized plants for the bulb species. So I kind of organize these by height and kind of by moisture. When it comes to the annual forbs, I think it's best to seed them in fall or in very early spring. Most of our plants are what we call cool season annuals. They're annuals that want to grow when it's cool and wet, mostly because that's when we have moisture. But they'll take advantage of the season based on when you sow them. So if you sow them in the spring, they might just grow a little bit shorter than they would as if they were planted in fall. These are two of my favorite species and these are pretty tall. This is showy tarweed and farewell to spring. I like growing them together. I think they're really pretty. And there's some of the later blooming annuals. So I like I like them for that aspect for the pollinators. These two are more medium-sized ones, and they're pretty adaptable. They can grow in some pretty saturated soils, and they can deal with dry situations. And annuals are great for really dry habitats because they'll just take advantage of the season. So as it starts to dry out, they'll just stop growing and they'll flower. So in dry areas, they'll just be shorter, which is fine because you can still get cover and they'll still bloom. So they're a good use for incredibly dry habitats, but most of these will tolerate pretty wet conditions too. This is bluegilia and Grand Colomia. Both of these are in the phlox family and they have blue pollen. And so if you get to watch bumblebees go to them in mass plantings, they'll have blue pollen sacs, and it's great. It's super cool to look at. So these two are great for really wet areas, and they tend to be pretty short. This is rosy plectritis and popcorn flower. And there's lots of other vernal pool, super wetland annuals out there. Like monkey flower is another one I didn't mention, which kind of can be a annual or perennial, but it's really, really super showy. That's the other thing about annuals. They're great because they're really showy. They have a short season, they're showy. These ones are really, I like these in mass plantings also. They're pretty fabulous. I feel like most of the diversity in my landscape comes from perennial forbs. They're sort of the backbone of all of our landscapes, and whether it's native or non-native, there's pretty much, you can pretty much find any sort of style of plant you like, the different flower colors, the different flower shapes. So it's really hard to cover all the forbs out there. But here are some of my favorites. These are some of the taller ones that you'd find that are native here in the valley. Checker mallows, milkweed, and narrowleaf mule's ears. And I don't think I have a species specific slide for the narrowleaf mule's ears, but they're these gorgeous yellow sunflowers. And I love them. They're really long lived. They're gorgeous. And even like the seeds in the fall are great for birds. All the finches will come and sit on them and pick all the seeds out. So, and they're interesting because I find them in wet prairies, but you also find them in dry areas too. So they're pretty adaptable, but they're slow. They do take a long time before they flower. These are the checker mallows. We have a lot of different species here in the valley. These plants are in the hollyhock family. They're incredibly showy when they're in bloom and they get fairly tall. Rose checker mallow, which is the more of the bright pink one that's there, only gets about 3 to 4 feet tall and has more of like a spreading open habit. And the meadow checker mallow is paler. It's much more upright and it can get really tall. It can be like 6 feet tall. All the checker mallows are really long lived. They're hardy. Their crown grows wider and wider as they age, but they don't really send out like runners. And so they look good as an individual plant, or they look good planted in groups too. People seem to have strong feelings about this plant. It's important because it's the host for the caterpillars of monarch butterflies only eat this plant. So it's very important for them. But it can be a problem once it's established because it does spread all over and it can become pretty unruly. I've even seen it grow under sidewalks and pop up in other places. It's an interesting plant because it goes completely dormant in the winter, and then it pops up in both the old places and the new places in the spring. And even aside from the monarchs, this is a really important pollinator plant. I see lots of different bees and flies and stuff on it. So in terms of more like medium plants, these plants can be like 2 to 3 feet tall and flower. And kind of like Jeannie mentioned, goldenrod is a pretty adaptable species, and it will be more tolerant of drier areas if it's in shade. And shading and water will also impact the height of some of these plants. When we've taken really good care of our goldenrod fields, it will be more like 4 to 5 feet tall. But typically when I see it growing out in an unirrigated setting, it's a lot shorter, like probably not much more than 3 feet. The top three there, the goldenrod, the asters, and the yarrow, they're a bit aggressive, so be careful where you put them. They really will take over and knock out other plants. And then the other two, the columbine and the geranium, they do have more of a compact crown and won't bully other plants out of your garden. I hope more people like hear about this plant. It's really hard to do seed increase on. I think it's pretty easy to do plant production on, so that I think the nurseries are starting to carry it. But as far as use and restoration, we've had a really hard time being able to get this plant back on the landscape. And it's beautiful. It is a really nice plant. It tends to be in more like oak savanna, oak woodland kind of areas, so it can live in full sun to partial shade, and I love it. Western columbine, there's lots of ornamental varieties of this, but I've always been super partial to the Western ones, this red ones. It's pretty adaptable. You'll see it in full sun to partial shade. So these plants are ones that'll be more like 1 foot to 1.5 feet tall. These ones look nice in borders or at the base of other plants because they're compact and they don't like spread and run everywhere. Here's Oregon iris. This one can be a little bit particular about where it likes to live. It doesn't like really saturated soils. I tend to see it on grassy slopes and hillsides, and that seems to be its preferred place to live. It doesn't seem super particular about the amount of sun or shade that it gets. It doesn't like deep shade, but it definitely has some adaptation to soil type and drainage. This is Oregon sunshine. This loves full sun, but you'll find it in like saturated wetlands, and you'll find it in uplands. You'll find it in alpine areas. So it's really adaptable, and different populations I've worked with have different color foliage. It's a super adaptable plant found all over the West, and I'm really happy to see it commercially available because it's definitely one of my favorites. But I keep saying that, so I mean, obviously I picked my favorite plants, but it's really it's in my top 5. Western buttercup. This is one that you'll see a lot in pastures in the spring with camas. It is an early spring plant. It's okay in a landscape. It's not as showy as some of the others, but I do like it. And especially, yeah, the early spring when a lot of the syrphid flies are out, they will really gravitate towards this plant. So like I said, native bulbs are kind of just like the non-native bulbs. The foliage emerges in late winter to early spring, and then the flowers follow. We have no native fall blooming bulbs. All of them are spring blooming bulbs. And I think the bulbs look best in mass plantings. And a lot of the bulbs too, like if you plant some, they will multiply over time and kind of fill in. So you can get these thicker plantings you can start with a small group of them and they will over time fill in and multiply. And here's just some of my favorites. This is also called, Mariposa lily or cat's ear. I tend to find this in well-drained places. Full sun, you find this on, again, slopes, well-drained hillsides, grasslands. This one is super cool. I usually see it in like oak savannas or oak woodlands, so it can take a little bit more shade. It's also in a little bit wetter areas. I think it has a wider range in which it can live in. This one's a little bit like the Mariposa lily, that I see it a little bit more in dry sloped areas, but it also does well in semi-shaded environments too. Camas, Jeannie mentioned this one. I love this plant because it's really hardy, and it's like 3 to 4 foot tall when it blooms. It's just a gorgeous, like striking plant. It's really common in wet areas, but it can also do pretty well in dry areas. We grow it in an upland area, and I'm surprised at how well it grows. It reseeds pretty well, and the new bulbs will be established as long as there's a little bit of bare ground under the bulbs. But it can take around 4 years from seed to a flowering bulb. So over time, you'll have these beautiful camas patches, but it'll take some years. All right, let's talk about understory plants. Oh, the plants that are seen here in this picture are called the Oregon fawn lily, and I'll talk about them a little bit later when I go over bulbs. So this grouping are the plants that I would consider when you have like a mature forest. This is deep, good shade, not kind of dappled shade or like woodland. This is forest. You can see the column on the left shows the evergreen ones. The column on the right is more the deciduous ones. And if it has a little GC by it, that means that it's more of a ground cover, and can, especially the sorrel, which is also known as like oxalis, they can be a little aggressive and spread when they are put in the right habitat. So these ones can all be kind of particular about where they are, not just shade, but sometimes they also need that kind of that rich, good forest soil. But if you have a shady area, I still recommend trying them and seeing if they like your site. And for these ones, I put shady, meaning not super deep shade, but it's sort of like that transitional edges, at forest edges, or not total shade. But here's, I run into this often when I'm in like wet oak forest. This is that Columbia larkspur. I think it's just beautiful on these giant mass plantings. And I think it's becoming more commercially available. So it's something you can have. So if you have shade, like wet shade, this is actually a really good plant. And these are some, I already showed the pictures of the fawn lilies. I think they're beautiful. I've heard of other people having even like fawn lily lawns. So people really do like get mass plantings of the fawn lilies. There's tiger lilies here. I see them mostly on the edges of forests. They like some shade, but sometimes you'll find them in full sun. And then shooting stars tend to be a little bit more in wet areas, and shady. That's where that, like Jeannie was describing, that combination between shade and moisture. There's a, so that can sort of create different habitats of, they might tolerate more sun if they have more moisture. This one. So I don't know if this is more of a problem up in like Yamhill and Marion County, but one problem we have in Corvallis, where I live, is this heavy clay. Like I live in a swamp. I feel like I have like the worst soil. It would make better plates than it would growing plants because it's so heavy. And so I was thinking, like, what can I possibly grow in my backyard that's going to do okay? And then so I sometimes then think about what I see in nature. And oh, in clay, I tend to see more like tubers and bulbs and annuals, because they can take advantage of the short season that you get, because it's like saturated and super wet in the winter, and then it's like concrete in the summer. So I decided to use a mix of annuals and bulbs to create a landscape back there, but it doesn't look great in the fall. It's terrible. But that's when I have like other things grow up in front of it, so you can where it's not as clayey, to kind of cover up how this area looks in the fall. So I used camas bulbs and limatium tubers, and there's other wetland plants that will look good in these areas. And then I used annual seeds in the areas, and over time they just keep reseeding themselves, and they look good. I used Douglas meadow foam, which is technically not a Willamette Valley native. It's native to Southern Oregon, also called like poached eggplant. It's like the yellow and white flower that you can see out here. And then I use popcorn flower and rosy Platrytis. It gives the pink and the white. And that seems to create a pretty nice, like flowery spring landscape in this challenging situation. Other things I like to consider about species selection is if whatever season that you want to focus on, you can kind of choose things. So in fall, having plants that have beautiful foliage, like yellow leaves or red leaves, you can choose things like dogwood, which has red leaves and these white berries, and vine maple will turn all sorts of colors, and Pacific ninebark is really pretty. It turns yellow. So those can help create more choices in your landscape if you like to focus on those things. And then winter here, there's lots of green. There's no shortage of green in our winters. But I like using Pacific willow or rhododendron dogwood because they have these really pretty stems. Pacific willow has yellow stems, and rhododendron dogwood has red stems in the winter. Snowberry has the white berries that hang on through the winter, and a lot of the roses, the hips will stay too, so you get the color red in there. And these things are, also good for, birds if you have these things, the rose hips staying on the plants too. And having some evergreen shrubs can help with winter too, like I mentioned with the ceanothus.
Amy,
Yes?
we're coming close to our 3:30. I want to make sure we have enough time to let people know where they can get their native plants from,
Mm-hmm.
and then move on to a Q&A at some point. How many slides do you still have?
Okay, like 2.
Okay, perfect.
2 or 3.
All right.
Okay, I'll be quick.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So aside from, spring bloom is also another thing to think about when choosing plants. So osoberry and red flying currant and willows are some of the first species to bloom in our area. And I've talked a lot about pollinators, so I'm not going to go into a lot more about which species to think about. But in NRCS practices, we try to focus on picking out 3 species that bloom in each of the seasons, so like early, mid, and late. So trying to create season-long bloom is a really important thing for pollinators. And shrubs can add early bloom in a landscape. And then wildlife habitat and birds, picking out species that have berries or seeds are really important things in your landscape. And this is my last slide. My tips for gardening, it's also applicable for life. Do your homework, take risks, learn from failures, adapt, repeat, and make sure you enjoy it. All right, and here's some of my contact info. If you need to get a hold of me after this for any reason, I can answer questions.
All right, thanks, Amy. We're gonna wrap it up here with the native plant sale information. Marion Soil and Water Conservation District, Yamhill, and Polk SWCDs all have native plant sales happening right now. Online ordering is currently open for all 3 of these sales. Polk SWCD, their pickup is this weekend. So if you want something from that sale, order it now. Get out there, get online right now and go to the Polk SWCD website and look for their native plant sale. Marion Soil and Water Conservation District, ours is open until February 26th. We are selling out quite fast. There's not a lot of species left. Our pickup is March 12th and 13th at Bauman's Farm and Garden. And Yamhill SWCD, I looked at their site. They don't have a lot left either, but they're also doing their online ordering, and their pickup is coming up at the beginning of March as well. And in the link to your resources, there is a local native plant nursery list that has wholesale and retail nurseries included with it. So you should get that and check out that list as well. And of course, you could always email any of the partners that are included in this programming and ask questions about native plants as well. And to just follow up, we just want to say thank you for participating. And again, here's all the partners. On behalf of all the partners, thank you so much for attending. And Amy went a little bit extra long in her presentation, but we'll just kind of bump the Q&A onto the next part, and you can ask questions for Amy and just generally about the entire program. So hopefully some folks can stay on, and we have about a half hour still for more questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. That was some incredible information about native plants, and we have quite a few questions in the Q&A box, so I'm going to get started. For one, what native plants are good partners for fruit and vegetable gardens?
I use both annuals and perennials in my plantings, much like I would use like the non-native ones too. I try to use plants that are small, like I do use prunella I use some of the smaller checker mallows. I don't use anything that runs. Like I would never use like yarrow or asters. So plants that are compact, well behaved. And oh, this kind of goes along with that question too that someone had about like annuals, the reseeding with the annuals. One way to stop it is you just cut the plants before they go to seed, which sometimes can really reduce the flowering because some of them are both like they'll be dropping seed while they're still flowering. So for me, I just try to pick plants that will work well with the vegetable plants.
All right, Amy, we have another question here, and I think you touched on it a little bit, but maybe we can be more specific in terms of height. But do you have a recommendation for native shrubs that grow 2 to 3 feet high in full sun?
Yeah, so I think, snowberry is one of those that it's short. It's not so, it's kind of shrubby looking. Kinnikinnick is another one that can be kind of like more like a ground cover. I would say those. And sometimes there's really compact manzanitas that are ornamentals, I think.
Thank you.
Great. And then we have another question. Thanks for all the helpful answers. Can I plant native, well, I think she means native plant seeds in the ground now. I bought some from Benton County sale and have not yet put them in. It's going to snow soon. I live in Corvallis.
Yeah, so this is the time of year where actually, I don't do a lot of seeding between like November 15th and February 15th, because usually seeds and plants here don't really grow if the soil temperatures are below 50. So I would wait until like February 15th. Actually, we have some things that we need to put in on our farm right now at work. And we're like, oh, it's going to get cold again. Because I was thinking it was going to get above 55. And that's kind of the cutoff for me. When it starts getting back, we have days around 55. That's when I feel confident. Not that the seeds will die if you plant them any sooner. It's just that they won't grow fast. And it's more likely that they'll be eaten by slugs or they'll just have a slow start. So I would wait until after this cold period that we're going to have. But we also, if you're willing to water into the dry season a little bit, it's okay to sow seeds even into April, even late April. You'll have to water them if we have a really dry spring. But.
All right, another question here. We have a stream in the middle of our acreage and many camas growing along our driveway. We are working to establish pasture grass along the edge of this area. Will the camas be able to continue to thrive among the pasture grass?
If it's established bulbs, they usually do pretty well. Like I actually see a lot of camas persist in pastures. I think there's something about, especially hayed pastures, there's something about the management that seems to work. I don't think you would be able to get new seedlings established, but existing bulbs should persist.
Great. We have a question about Mahonia. I believe that's Oregon grape. Is that right? Yeah. This person wants to know if they spread by rhizomes. They were told that the plant does not spread. It's very pretty, a slightly different shape from a native tall Oregon grape, but does put out flowers and berries too.
In my experience, they spread. They definitely have some underground structure. I don't know, I don't keep up on exact terms for a lot of what they call them, but it definitely has underground stems that will spread and pop up in new places. I know that for the tall Oregon grape. The dwarf one, that I'm not sure on that one, but I definitely know the tall one does.
Okay, I think you touched on this a little bit, but just again, when is the best time of year to plant trees and shrubs?
I always think actually in the fall. As soon as the soil becomes incredibly saturated, putting them in November and December is really good. But I also know that the bare root nurseries don't dig them at that time. So even, I would say based on when people can actually get their plants, the best time is as soon as possible. And again, I wouldn't plant right before a really, really, really hard freeze. because you might get a little bit of frost heaving, but the winter and the wet season is always the best time. None of our plants really get damaged from cold here because we're not that cold. The biggest stressor to them usually is moisture limitation. But like Jeannie said, watering stuff for the first couple years, especially for shrubs, just a little bit of water to get them through the summer is really important when they first get established, and then they should be fine.
And then to follow up on that, there's a similar question, a confirmation that planting annual seeds in the winter is the way to go?
Like I said, kind of like fall, like if you can do it in September, just as September and early October, right as it starts to rain, or if you do it in the spring, like I would say, like starting February 15th into, but we don't have, in the Midwest, most of their species are warm season plants. They have a lot of warmth and they have a lot of rain. So, and that's where a lot of our horticulture plants have come from, is in the Midwest, because they're really beautiful. Our plants are kind of different because they're cool season plants, because that's when we have our water. So I wouldn't seed too late into the warm months. So I would say, yeah, usually before April 15th or into late April. But if you water, you can get away with it a little bit more.
All right, Amy, I have a question here from Leslie. Thank you for suggesting the lilac. I was talking to another native plant person who also recommended looking at Northern California native plants because of climate change. I have to say, I felt like I was kind of cheating. Do you feel that drawing from Northern California is also a good way of addressing our changing climate and land as we try to use native plants?
I think in some ways, and the climate modeling for our area is interesting because we might have drier summers, which works well with Northern California plants. But the problem is that our minimum temperatures, like our cold minimum temperatures, aren't going to change. And that, I think, is actually what can be limiting for the California species. So I don't know if we'll see a lot of the California ones really make it up here if our winter temperatures still are as low as they, we're still going to get hard freezes and stuff. But I say if you like it and it lives here and it's not a problem, if it doesn't become invasive, then use it. And I never see the ceanothus, that California lilac, I never see it die back, even when we've been like 8 degrees and have some of the coldest temps I've seen in the valley. It doesn't die back. But like redbud and some of the other things, even baccharis, the coyote brush, some of the more of the California species, I have seen them die back to the ground. They don't completely die, but they can get knocked back. But the ceanothus, I haven't seen that.
So Stuart has a question. In the book, Nature's Best Hope, the author suggests that the plants best for birds are plants that are eaten and used by the larvae of all sorts of insects. Have you any suggestions for the best natives from that standpoint? For example, plants that bugs love to eat and lay their eggs on. Or better yet, can you suggest the best brochures?
Yeah,
Can
I don't know
chime in
much
on
about that.
Oh.
Wait.
Can I chime in on that one?
Yes.
There's in their resources, there is a pollinator guide for plants of the Willamette Valley, and it shows it shows host plants, which are the plants that pollinators and insects will lay their eggs on, and the ones that the larvae will eat. So those are like in bold font with a little asterisk. So check out that pollinator plant guide. It also shows bloom time and bloom color for trees and shrubs and flowering plants in the Willamette Valley.
Thank you so much.
All right, Amy, Cynthia asks, I live in Lincoln County with native plants. Is there any place to learn more about the foraging or edible plant life that you prefer?
I'm not an expert on that, and I'm not sure where to get resources on that. So, not much help there.
I can chime in that though I'm not, I don't live or work in Lincoln County. I know there are many Facebook pages, and if you do a search for edible or foraging plants, Lincoln County, you may just find a group that can be a really good resource. I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised.
I can kind of contribute to that a little bit. Here at the Yamhill SWCD, we have a great book that talks about edible plants and other things from the Coast Range into the valley. I don't know if that would help. I can't remember what it's
That's
called.
a good one. John,
To our resources.
Yeah,
Nice.
I can add it.
John Callis is a nutritionist and a teacher, and he's a wild forager that has Oregon's wild edibles. Travel Oregon has his publication. I can share that with Suzanne
Terrific.
for resources.
Great. We have another question from Jerry asking about Salal. Is that a good ground cover, and where does it grow best? He has clay soils.
It mostly grows, it's more, I think of it being more of a coastal plant. I think it likes some moisture. I think it likes some shade. I don't know about its tolerance of clay soils, but it's a pretty aggressive plant. So, and it's available. So that's where I'd say, like, just try it and see if it works.
Yeah, I can chime in a little bit on that. It is a real slow establisher. So it might take a little extra time to get it to grow. But if you do have shade and you give it, and shade, moist shade, usually. I have grown it without irrigation though. After it's established, it gets pretty aggressive. And so it'll be there for a few years and you'll be getting comfortable with it. And then all of a sudden it will just take off. And I had it on an east, morning sun, east side of my house. But it was contained with like a brick rockery. And after it was established, I never watered it, no matter how hot or dry. This was in Seattle. I never watered it, and just give it a little haircut once a year and it's good. But it needs a lot of room to run if it gets established. So it's a good, I would say, for a slope that you want to have just one thing on, and it's a shady slope, that would be a good choice because it's evergreen. And be careful about walking on the roots, because if it gets any soil compaction early on in that first 3 to 5 years, it will knock it right back.
All right, I have a question here and one that's kind of similar after it. I just bought a house on a ½ acre. Its lawn is full of weeds. I've dug out the blackberry. How do I prep this land for adding natives? And the question after that is tips for transitioning from lawn to native garden, specifically with clay soil.
Okay. I'll kind of like give a quick overview, but there's also really great resources out there for like how-tos on this. But I would say the most important thing is that you have to remove the existing plant community. Thinking that you're just gonna like put some of the native plants out there and they'll just like take over the weeds, that doesn't happen. You really have to remove that existing plant community. And there's chemical ways to do it. There's manual ways to do it. And there's like material ways to do it. So you can like smother it. So people do like to use things like cardboard and leaves, and that will smother the existing plant community. Things like tillage can kill the existing plant community, and chemicals can kill the existing plant community. So that's kind of the first step, is you have to think of how to deal with that. If you use a smother technique, and then you add compost or something on top of that, then you have a nice clean slate, and it's also not filled with weeds. So sometimes that can be the quickest way to get to where you would want to seed or plant into. The other problem with, if you don't do an addition of like compost and things like that, once you've removed your existing plant community, you still have to deal with all the weeds that are in the soil. There's millions of weed seeds that are sitting there waiting to germinate as soon as you create this new open spot for them. And they're going to be competing with everything that you're trying to install. When we do large scale restoration, we have to think about both of those before we put all of our natives in. You can, in smaller landscapes, like on your yard, you can be a little bit more proactive by using I do like the smother technique. I think it works with almost all weeds, that you can actually smother them and then putting compost over it. creates a nice substrate for being able to seed into. So you kind of eliminate both problems of existing plant community and weed seeds in the soil. And there are, I can't think of any things right off the top of my head, but I know there are resources out there of how different ways to do this, like solarization or smothering or chemicals and tilling. A lot of times we call them site prep methods.
Thank you, Amy. Another question here. I planted Clarkia amina, I'm going to say that wrong probably, in spring 2020 for the first time. They flowered beautifully all summer and into fall. They still have almost all their leaves. Is this normal to keep their leaves through the winter?
That's unusual for sure. A lot of times they die back, but if they had some, you know, residual moisture in the summer, that might have kept them green. And they might live and flower this year too, but they probably won't look as good as some fresh plants. But I have seen that with some annuals. If they can kind of like survive our summer drought, they'll kind of hang on.
All right, I have a question here. Any tips on how to shade out blackberry with natives?
Big trees over a long period of time. It's not a quick answer.
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
Well, we have another question about size. I love elderberries, but the size scares me. Can they be kept smaller?
Yeah, actually, they're you can cut them back and they'll resprout. And every time they resprout, they will get bigger. But it's definitely a way to keep them under control, so they won't turn into a huge tree, because they can get really big. Other things, if they have less water and full sun, that can kind of stunt them too.
All right, question. What about mowing a meadow-like yard just before the fire season?
There's lots of factors in deciding mowing or not mowing. And if you're worried about wildfires, that's really important. And mowing it can cut down on the amount of dry material surrounding your house. Most plants will not be damaged by fall mowing, because most of our stuff is dormant and will resprout the following year. And I mean, like Jeannie said too, like as far as pollinators and birds, having a messy standing winter and fall landscape is really important, but that shouldn't, you know, override your own safety when it comes, you know, to wildfires.
We have a great question here about rain gardens. Can either you, Amy or Jeannie, do you have any suggestions for what plants to use in rain gardens or to plant around rain chains near a home? I think rain drains. I'm not sure what rain chains are.
Do you want to go, Jeannie?
Sure. Well, you know, those ditch plants are always great. Rushes, sedges. There's some really ornamental sedges, and hopefully they'll be more commercially available as time goes on. And they have beautiful seeds, you know, seed heads that last into the winter and provide, you know, interest and also seeds for birds. Red twig dogwood, if you have the space for it, you know, it can get quite large. But again, like Amy said, you can coppice or cut stuff to the ground every once in a while. Do it in the dormant season, and they'll come right back again. Let's see, what else, Amy? Any kind of wetland plant, although it would be going dry in the summer, so that maybe keeping something, well, dogwood would be fine. You know, something that looks good in the dormant season. The thing about dogwood is that it's got those beautiful ornamental stems. It's got berries, it's got flowers. So it's got kind of multi-season interest.
Yeah, I wouldn't really add anything. I think a lot about the russes and the sedges are really great in rain gardens, and then any of the perennial floors that are really wet loving, and then even camas. I think camas would do fine there too.
All the bulbs.
Yeah.
One thing that I like for almost, it's kind of an all-purpose plant, like sort of like checker mellow is potentilla or cinquefoil. Any of those, they bloom a long time. They have these happy yellow flowers, and they just seem to bloom a long time. Like I have one where I was kind of in a vegetable garden situation, and it's just so pretty and really attractive to pollinators. So something like that would be good because it would be attractive over, if it's right at your downspout, you would see it more often.
Oregon State University has a fantastic rain garden guide that came out several years ago. You could do a Google search for it, or we can add the PDF to the resources link and put that in there. It has it shows you how to build a rain garden from scratch, and has great plant recommendations as well.
Yeah, and I would like to add that if there are resources being mentioned that have not yet made it into the resources link that I've sent, and I will, you'll all get that link again in an email. Everyone registered will get a follow-up email with that link in it. I will add those resources that were newly mentioned, so it'll be a updated link when you get it tomorrow, probably tomorrow. And I do want to say that Nancy here has a great recommendation to see some natives in the ground. If you're in Polk County or near it, you can visit the Delbert Hunter Arboretum in Dallas City Park. It's free. It's open dawn to dusk. It's over 7 acres, and it's maintained by volunteers. That's great. I work near Polk County, and I didn't know about that, so I'll have to check that out. That's Delbert Hunter Arboretum. And there's a question about gophers, not exactly a native plant, but maybe a lot of people have some issues with gophers. And if either you or Jeannie or Amy have a thought about what to do about them or what you think about them, that would be great.
Yeah, gophers can be super destructive. And I always wish that I could make a deal with them. Like, you can live here, but you can't live here. If we could just communicate with them and say, I sacrifice this half of my property for you, but you just can't be over here, it would be great. But unfortunately, they don't cooperate. And I have seen those, what are they kind of like? They emit some sort of sound or something in the ground. I have seen them help with keeping them away. But trapping actually ends up being the best way to just reduce their numbers. And I can't say that they're particularly attracted or not attracted. I see them everywhere. I see them if it's just grass, they pop up in our gravel roads. They kind of just go everywhere. And they can be really destructive, especially in bulb fields or tubers or things like that. They definitely go towards those. So I would say, if you're okay with lethal methods, I would trap them. But definitely try those little, I can't think of what they're called. It's like some sort of sonic emitter or
they're
something.
like sticks in the ground that emit.
Yeah, and they help. I don't think they help really far, but they do help.
Jeannie, yeah, I thought you might have some response as well.
Well, maybe I'm not the best person to ask because first of all, I've never had a problem, but I have 20 acres of oak woodland and savanna and mixed forest, and it just doesn't really come into it. I mean, I have a lot of moles and whatnot too. So, but I love gophers, and up in Washington, the Mazama pocket gopher is actually listed as threatened, I think, maybe endangered. But the reason I like them is because they do so much work. They're like beavers in the ground. They aerate, they dig, and all that soil turning and churning is really beneficial for soil aeration, and then also drainage, obviously, because it gets the water down into the soil where it can be stored. But again, I have never had a problem with them, so maybe I just want to put a plug in there for wildlife. If you don't have a problem, if you just see them and you're not losing plants, I would say just let them be for a while and see how it goes. If you do have an issue, then I just don't have an experience like that.
Yeah, I agree with Jeannie. I mean, they are really important, animals in our ecosystem, and but I know that we only have a certain level of tolerance for damage in our landscapes. But yeah, they provide a lot of ecosystem benefits. The other thing that they provide too, especially in wild landscapes, is that with all that soil disturbance, they also create fresh, bare soil for annuals to keep reseeding in. So as far as like a functioning plant community, they're really wonderful, and they're really cute. I don't know if you've ever seen like their little faces, but they're really adorable.
Yeah, they are totally cute. And the other thing they do is they provide burrows. Mice, moles, voles, all of those. And our native bees and bumblebees will use those burrows, those old burrows, for nests. And again, the bare soil. So as far as that interaction goes, it's super helpful.
I see salamanders. In the
yeah. So it kind of fits in with the whole ecosystem process, because it's like owls and woodpeckers. They need each other because of the way they live, and so each one is able to take advantage of what the other one creates.
Thank you so much. Will we have some time for any additional questions? We have just about 6 or 7 minutes left. If anyone left out there has some burning questions, you have the spotlight. And while we wait for some of those questions, if there are any left to come in, I'd love to hear, we hadn't talked too much about insects since the gophers came up. What about, integrated pest management, insects that are able to help and alleviate some of the pests that come about with our gardens and our native plants? Is there a resource for that, or anyone have any thoughts about attracting those kind of insects to our gardens?
Well, we've had different people come and like survey our fields of native plants for beneficial insects. And these are the ones that are like predatory wasps or lacewings, or basically they prey on plant pests is really what they are. And we find that there are some specific plants that tend to, like actually yarrow is a good one. If they're like open, flat flowers can sometimes attract more of those beneficial insects. But what we find is basically like the more diverse your habitat is, the more you have a functioning ecosystem. So you'll attract more of your predatory insects and your beneficial insects if you have diverse plantings.
Mm-hmm. Do we have a question here? Great camas, do moles like the bulbs?
I don't know if I should disclose this on something that's being recorded, but if I have to trap a gopher, I actually use camas as bait. We have a huge camas field at work, and so we have it, but they like bulbs. They will go for it. I mean, it's just, yeah.
Moles, however, eat.
Moles are different.
Worms. Yeah, moles do not eat those. It's the gophers that are eating the roots. But moles and voles and those, they eat little soil insects and worms. And they do a huge aeration job as well.
Great. Well, we're getting some thank yous in here, and I'll echo that. Amy and Jeannie, it's amazing the variety of questions you can answer and field for us. Thank you so much for your wells of wisdom that you share with us.
All right. What about squirrels with great canyons?
I haven't had a problem with squirrels. So I hear about them being an issue though with some of the other like tubers and other things where the squirrels will dig them up, but I personally haven't had that problem.
And I just want to respond again about, there's a question here about the resources, and there has been a lot of information, and there's no way to retain it all, even when we're paying close attention and writing notes. And I promise I will send out that link to the resource page that will be updated. It won't be today, most likely, because I want to update it. So it'll be tomorrow. Everyone registered, whether they attended or not, will not only get that link to the resource page sent directly to the inbox of whatever email you use to sign up for this. You'll also get a link to the recording. This has been recorded. You can share it with others. You can watch it again. So it's also going to be on YouTube. It's already airing live on YouTube, but it will be released on our page again after this presentation is over. You'll have all of that directly to your inbox. So thanks for that question.
All right, we have another question here. Are sugar ants a sign of unbalance? Are there management ideas for them?
Well, again, I would say that ants are a pretty good sign in the garden because they also have their roles to play. And by the way, northern flickers eat ants. That's their thing. But I know there's a concern sometimes about how ants plant aphids on plants and tend them and defend them against their enemies. So I can't say there's no negative effects, but I would say the more wildlife that you have in your garden, the better off you're going to be. And if you tend the environment, if you minimize disturbance, if you leave stems and leaves as long as possible, and just kind of stand back and observe, you'll probably see some of those interactions happening and the checks and balances coming into play a little bit more. With the diversity of plants, you should find that you have more of a diversity of wildlife and less problems. And again, native plants, of course, not so many problems, insect or disease wise. And Amy will probably have more to say too.
Actually, I would just echo what Jeannie said. I don't think that ants are a sign of a problem. I tend to find a lot more of those little black ants in wet areas, and I'm not sure, really why that is. But I wouldn't say it's a sign of a non-functioning ecosystem. And yeah, and I think it is like it's food for birds, it's food for other animals, and they don't come with a lot of other negative aspects to them.
Well, I can't leave this one little question hanging. So I'm gonna ask this one, and that's it. But we have a question about bleeding hearts. Is there a trick to keeping them? Because Jerry is having trouble keeping them.
I really haven't. Yeah, I haven't had too many problems with them. I think they like the combo of a certain level of shade and certain moisture. But Jeannie might have more experience with that one, maybe.
Oh, let's see. I suppose I've killed my share of bleeding hearts. Probably, they kind of like rich, duff-filled soil, I think. Does that sound right? And how have I killed them? Probably not enough water, not enough moisture. So, it's more of a woodland plant. So if you had moist and deeper soil, like a place perhaps where deer fern like to grow, maybe something more like that. And I don't know, a lot of people think that they're kind of aggressive, actually. I think if you're having trouble, maybe just try watering them a little bit during the dry season. Try that. Make sure they've got plenty of shade.
Thanks, Jeannie. Well, if there are any other questions, I will be sure to post Amy and Jeannie. They've agreed that their email addresses, it's okay to put them up. We'll have those emails also in our resources section for you to ask specific questions, because we are out of time. And Jenny, do you want to say any closing words before we say goodbye?
I didn't have anything else. Thanks everybody for coming. We have a few diehard people, 44 people still left on. So thanks for sticking with us to the end, everybody. And stay tuned for those extra resources. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Amy and Jeannie. Bye-bye.